Welcome to part one of this in-depth series on using Native Instruments Form. Now, Form is a sample-based synthesizer, so if you're someone who likes to take your own audio samples, whether they're full songs, random wave files, loops, or field recordings, and then manipulating those sounds to create something unique that no one else has, then Form is really great for that. You can create your own leads, basses, soundscapes, anything you'd like, pads. And so in this part one video, we're going to develop a solid foundation in finding our way around with Form, what its different sections are, and some of the basic parameters to get you going with making sounds right away. Now we'll start with the most basic of basics, and that's just accessing presets and your audio samples. So over in the side pane here, we have Form Ensemble down below, and all I did was double click on that to load the Form synthesizer. We could also drag this over to the blank area to load it. Now up at the very top, if I click on the plus, we can expand out the Form folder. We have the documentation presets. So if I expand this folder out, then we have the different categories of presets: bass, hybrid, instruments, keys, leads, and so on. By clicking on those, we can access the presets in the bottom pane. Let's go ahead and collapse that folder back. Now, the last folder is the audio samples that are included with Form. So in this way, we can access any of the samples that come with Form to manipulate these ourselves beyond what's been done to them in their use in the presets. So if we click on a sample, that's going to play back because I have this set to auto. If we don't want those to be automatically auditioned, we can turn the auto off, but I'll leave that on for now. We can start playback by clicking on the play button. We can also stop playback by clicking on that. We also have a volume control for the auditioning, so I'll actually take that down a little bit. Now, part of the whole fun of using Form is using our own samples that we have and that we'd like to change. So we could access our own files by coming to the Files tab here, and I've actually set up a favorite for my Sounds and Samples folder, which is where I have all of my audio samples. So by clicking on this drop-down menu, you could navigate to the location where you have your samples stored. If I come to home, we can see there's desktop, documents. So just navigate to where you have your samples. And so if I select documents, I can then come back to the favorites drop-down menu and then choose to add that to the favorites. So I'll come back to the player tab, come back to files, and then when I choose the favorites, we can see documents is added. If I select that, let's come back up, and I'm going to remove documents from favorites because I only need the Sounds and Samples where I have all of mine stored. If you'd like to start from scratch working with your own sample, you can click on the reset at the bottom, confirm that, then all of the parameters will be taken back to their default position, but that original sample is still loaded in here. So we can come to Sample Select. Let's expand out my drum samples folder, and then I can click hold and drag that onto the waveform display. I can audition and then choose load that sample. And now I can play that back and all of the parameters at their default, and you're ready to get started manipulating your sound. Once you've made your adjustments to the various parameters and you've got the sound that you like, you can always save it as a preset by coming over to the preset browser, and then here we have user. You can click on add, and I'll just call this new patch and then press enter to save that. And so now you'll always have access to the presets that you've created in this panel below. If you'd like to remove any presets that you've created, then you can just right click and move to trash. And let's come back to our browser and come to the player tab, and let's click on the Form folder. And also keep in mind that anytime you would like to initialize Form to a default state, you can click on the presets and then double click on the init there, and then you're going to have a blank slate to work with. We can also access our presets and init up here in the drop-down menu. So if I come over to factory, we can see the different subsections that are available for the presets. And I'm actually going to load up a preset here, and let's get started at taking a look at some of the parameters. And we're just going to start from the very top and work our way all the way down and cover everything here. I'm going to change this to the sample. So at the very top, we have our header. And as you see, we can choose what page displays in the main area here by clicking up above here. So this is the sample page, our sound page, and the effects. Let's come back to the sample. Now over to the right, we have an effects off, so we can globally disable all of the effects that are on a preset or something that we're working on if we'd like to hear our sample playing back without the effects. We can click on the lock, so if we're browsing through the presets up above using the up and down arrows, then those presets will load without the effects being turned on, as long as we have that lock engaged. I'll go ahead and turn that off, and this, we then have a global tuning to the right and global volume. Also in the header section, we have a sample select button, which takes us to the sample select page, where we can load audio samples by dragging and dropping onto the waveform display here. We can also audition the currently selected sample in its natural state without any processing. Clicking on the sample select will take us back to the previous page. Now next to the sample select, we can choose between 3 different voicing modes: polyphonic, mono retrig, or mono legato. By clicking on the arrow or clicking on the name there. When we're in mono legato, so if I play this back, if I hold a key and then press another one, we're immediately changing the pitch. But when we're in the legato mode, we can activate the glide to create a glide. Over to the right, we can reset the phase of the oscillator's note on with this button here. And finally, in the header section, we have several different voice modes that we can choose from. So we have single, unison, and multi-mode. Let's actually turn off that info display there. But actually know that if you need any tips while you're working with Form, you can click on the eye up above here, and then it's going to give you tips about anything that you hover over. But for now, we don't want that distraction. So let's come back to single, and this one has 1 performance slot active and 1 voice is triggered per key that's pressed. The performance slot has to do with down here. So as you can see, some of these circles are highlighted, and this means that we have different variations of this particular preset. So if I go ahead and trigger this and select another slot, we can choose from different variations of this preset. So when we have single, we're only going to be playing back 1 of these. Now we also have multi-mode, and with this, we can choose to play back 2 or up to 4 of these different variations. So by default, we have 2. So now when I trigger, we're playing these 2 different variations. If I click on this circle, we can now play 3. You can see these 3 are highlighted. Then if I click 4, you can see 4 are highlighted. So now we're playing all 4 variations back when we trigger with our external controller. Now the final mode that we have is unison. And in this mode, we're still using only 1 performance slot that's active down below. But each note we play can play back up to 4 voices parallelly. We can change between the number of voices by clicking on this circle here when in the unison mode. Let's come back to single. Moving on, we have our main section here in the center, and as we've seen, this will display whatever page that we have selected in the header. So the sample, sound, and effects. And this is really the only area that's going to change. Everything in the header is going to remain the same. Everything in our footer is going to remain the same. And in this part 1 video, we will only cover the sample page, and in part 2, we'll cover the sound and effects pages in more detail. So on the sample page, we have a display of the waveform of our loaded sample. We can also see a pitch curve that is created when Form analyzes our audio sample that we've chosen to load, but we can hide that pitch curve if we'd like by clicking on the pitch curve here to get rid of that. Clicking again, we bring it back. At any time, we can change the portion of our audio sample that's being played back. Right now, we're playing back the full sample because we can see our markers left and right or all the way at the edge. But if I click, hold, and drag, left click, hold, and drag down, then we can pull those markers in simultaneously. Dragging left or right, I can reposition them to play back any section of the audio that we'd like. We can also come to the handles and drag these independently of each other. We also have these visual displays in the upper left-hand corner that are going to update depending on to show the position of our markers. These can also be dragged as well to make adjustments. Now, if we right-click and hold and pull down, then we zoom in on our waveform. Pulling up, we zoom back out. And while we're holding down the right mouse button, we can also drag left and right to view our waveform horizontally. And if I double click, we're immediately taken to view our entire sample. And just a quick side note about the sample page, we can actually navigate to our samples, our audio samples that we have in the side panel here, and drag those directly onto the sample page as well. So we don't necessarily have to come to the sample select area to do that. Let's take our markers back out to the edges. And then finally at the bottom, we have our footer. And the footer has three main sections. We have the speed section, and this is for controlling the playback speed of our sample. We have motion, and this is the central hub for choosing, creating, and editing our motion curves. And then finally, we have perform. And as we briefly saw, in this section, we can save variations of our preset and choose to play these different versions of our preset back discretely or up to 4 at a time, as we saw up above here by changing this mode to multi-mode. Let's come back to single, and we'll take a more in-depth look at the perform section here in a later video. Now let's come back to the first section, the speed here, and we have different modes that we can choose from at the bottom. So the first one here, we have sample, and this sets the playback speed in relation to the speed of the original sample. Then we can just click on that to see. So the default of 1 means that it's going to play the original sample back at its original speed. We then have hertz, and the speed here is set in cycles per second. So we can take that all the way up to 16 cycles per second or down to 0. Double clicking, we can take it back to the default, and that's with any parameter here. Within form, double clicking will take it to its default. We then have BPM, and the speed here is set based on the tempo in your DAW. And by clicking, we can take that up and down, whole note, half, quarter, and so on. And then we have manual, and this allows you to manually control the playback position. And I actually really like this control. This is something that you can actually assign to an external controller if you have one, particularly to a rotary encoder. So if I right click on this and choose the MIDI and oscillator learn and turn a knob on my controller, now if I go ahead and trigger, then I can kind of manually sweep through that. Let's actually change our curve preset because there's some settings here that are interfering with that. Let's do the ramp up, close that out, and now so that's pretty cool. And you can actually apply automation to this as well if you'd like. And there's also a feature here in the sample window up at the top. We can grab this and change the position of our playback cursor. So if I trigger a note on my controller, we can use this slider up above as well. Now, one final thing about the sample and BPM modes is that they, unlike the hertz and manual, notice here, these can snap to the tempo in your DAW. So once we engage that, there's a few different modes for that. And the first one, we can see that first little LED there is lit. This is going to be normal mode. And then I click again, we go into triplet, and then we have dotted. Clicking again, we turn it off. So if you'd like to snap the sample or BPM to the tempo that you have set in your DAW, then you can use this button here. Now in the center we have the motion section, and explained simply, the motion section allows us to control the playback of our audio sample and the playback cursor here. Now with this basic ramp up version or preset that I chose from the curve presets when I selected here earlier, when starting at the bottom here, this means we start at the beginning of our audio sample. And then as the ramp increases, we end up at the top, and this represents the end of our sample. So with this idea to give us our bearings when we click on the curve presets, and say if I were to choose this ramp up and down, let's close out the curve preset window, then we know that this is going to start at the beginning of our sample, go to the end, and then it's going to go back to the beginning. So if I trigger the sample with my controller, let's take the speed down a little bit. And so I think it's a good idea to really get a better understanding of the motion section and the presets, as also the curve editor. This is beyond the scope of this tutorial. This is going to get its own tutorial in itself because there's a lot that we can do here. It's pretty deep actually, and it's really going to help you shape and create unique sounds once you have a better idea of what's going on in this editor. We can close that out by clicking on the button again. But coming back to the curve presets, when you have an understanding that starting at the bottom begins playback at the beginning of your sample and then up at the top stops at the end of your sample, that gives you a better idea of what the effect is going to be on the playback of your sample when you look at some of these more complex presets that you have, or if you're going to work on creating your own curves in the curve editor. Now we also have these up and down arrows that we can use to navigate between the different presets, so you don't necessarily have to open up the preset window if you don't want to. And we have arrows to the left and right where you can access even more complex and unique presets. And let's actually just give a listen to a couple of these other ones that are more complex. Let's take the speed up. And this actually has a loop set here. So let's take a look at that. We can take that loop off by clicking here. Let's move on to another one. So I think you can see and hear how these are really going to affect the sound of the preset that you're working on and the sample that you're using. And coming back to these sample modes here, or loop modes rather, we have off, which it was just in. If this is not highlighted, then we know that it's off. We also have infinite and loop release after node off. Just by clicking repeatedly, we can cycle through those. Now next to the loop modes here, we have loop directions, a button for setting those. We have 3 different options. We can choose between forward, backward, and alternating. So just by clicking, we can see we have forward, backward, and then the alternating. So if we choose the backward, and we're going to start from the end of our sample and move towards the front. Now we also have flip. So when we click that, we can see that our curve has been flipped. Clicking again, we return back to the original position. And let's come back to a simpler waveform. And let's take this back to forward. Let's also slow down the speed. So we've got retrig and free here. Now retrig restarts the motion curve on node on. So if I trigger a note, then another, you can see how our playback cursor jumps back to the beginning each time I press a note. If I were to set this to free, then it's going to, the note that I trigger sequentially after each other, then it's going to play back wherever the cursor is without re-triggering at the beginning of our audio sample. Now, the sync is going to sync playhead position for all voices in free mode when we have that activated. So if I play more than one voice, then they're all going to be played back at the position of our playback cursor. And we're going to take a closer look at all of these in depth in a future tutorial in this series, because this gets pretty deep when you work with some of these settings in relation to the curve editor and checking out the presets. So I want to dedicate an entire video to working with all of these. And we'll just finish up here at the very bottom. We've seen the reset sound, how we can reset any adjustments that we've made to the parameters or the effects and change those back to their default settings. So we would need to confirm that, or if we don't want to do that, we can click on the X. In the center here, we have macro controls, so we can assign these to a single parameter or multiple parameters to make changes to our sound. These are especially useful if you want to assign them to an external controller. Then you can use one fader or one knob to make drastic changes to your sound. Say maybe you want to have one of these macro knobs controlling a reverb amount and delay amount both at the same time, just as an example. And then finally, we have a mod amount in the bottom right-hand corner here. And this is a global control for modulation depth, or any modulation assignments that you've created in your preset. Okay, so this wasn't the most fun video for playing around with sound and tweaking things, but I think that it really sets a solid foundation so that in future videos, we can go ahead and experiment with how we can go about manipulating our samples with some of these other cool features like the form oscillator, the oscillator effects, and getting into modulation, and also taking a look at the effects. Those are going to be a bit more fun to take a look at and how they can be used to help change the samples that we're working with. So I hope this part 1 video has been useful for you if you're just getting started with Form, and I look forward to seeing you in the following tutorials. Thanks for watching.